A forbidden watchmaker in revolutionary Paris hides a secret clock that counts down to a condemned man's return. As he, Lucille, and Jacques risk everything against Commissaire Dubois's tyranny, their ticking creation becomes a symbol of memory, rebellion, and the fight to reclaim time itself.
Paris 1793. The city wears its terror like a shroud, thick and suffocating. The guillotine's shadow looms over every cobblestone, every whispered word, every stolen breath. Here, in the heart of a revolution that devours its own, time itself has become a weapon forbidden, erased, outlawed. No clocks tick in the streets, no watches shine on wrists, no hourglasses turn their sands. They are relics of a world that the Republic seeks to bury beneath its iron fist, symbols of privilege and tyranny that must be extinguished. I am Tyne Moreau, a watchmaker by blood and by fate, and in this city stripped of time I harbor a secret. A secret that beats quietly in my workshop, hidden beneath layers of dust and shadow, a clock unlike any other, defiant and forbidden. It does not merely mark the hours or minutes. It counts down to the return of a man, the last victim of the guillotine, whose fate is entwined with the fragile hope of freedom itself. The streets outside my window are empty, but for the occasional patrol of guards, their boots echoing like thunder in the silence. They move with the cold certainty of death, eyes sharp and unyielding. The law is absolute. All timepieces are to be destroyed, their keepers punished without mercy. Yet here, amidst the darkness, my clock ticks, a whisper against the silence, a heartbeat against the stillness. I sit at my bench, the tools of my trade laid out before me, tiny gears, springs, and hands that once measured moments of joy and sorrow, now relics of a forbidden craft. My fingers tremble slightly as I adjust the fragile mechanism, the soft tick-tick-tick, a sound I have not heard openly in years. It is a sound that stirs something deep within me, a mixture of fear, hope, and defiance. The clock's face is simple, yet unlike any I have ever made. Its hands move steadily backward, counting down not from a beginning to an end, but toward a reckoning yet to come. I do not know what hour it will strike, only that when it does, the city will tremble, and perhaps, so too will the chains that bind us. I recall the day the decree came, the day they marched through Paris, smashing clocks and watches, burning them in the streets as symbols of a corrupt past. Fathers and sons, artisans and merchants alike watched helplessly as their crafts were destroyed, their livelihoods erased. My own family was not spared. I still see my father's face, pale and resolute, as the guards tore through our shop. The last timepiece we owned was shattered beneath the boot of a revolutionary zealot, and with it, the last measure of time I trusted. But I could not let the world forget, not yet. Not while hope still flickers beneath the ash. I have hidden this clock, built in secret from salvaged parts, a testament to memory and resistance. Every night, I listen to its ticking as if it were a prayer, a promise that the future is not yet written. Outside, the city breathes heavy with fear. The guillotine's blade waits patiently, its shadow long and merciless. The streets know no rest, only the relentless march of watchful eyes and whispered betrayals. Yet within these walls, time dares to speak again. I glance toward the small window, the dim light of a gas lamp flickering like a dying star. A figure passes, cloaked and hurried, disappearing into the maze of alleys. The city's pulse is erratic, broken by cries and silence, hope and despair. My thoughts drift to the man whose return this clock heralds. Who he is, why his fate matters, I do not yet fully understand. But I know this: in a city where time is outlawed, where every moment is claimed by fear, this clock is a beacon, a defiant heartbeat in the dark. The night deepens, the candle guttering, the shadows lengthening. I close my eyes and listen. Tick, tick. The forbidden tick, steady and sure. Will the city hear it? Will the hour come when we can reclaim time, reclaim freedom? For now, the clock keeps counting, and so do I. The silence breaks once more, and with it, the promise of a new dawn or the echo of another fall. But until that moment, I remain the watchmaker in the shadow, the keeper of the forbidden, tick waiting for the hour when the past and future collide. And in that waiting I am both prisoner and rebel. The clock ticks on. The air in the workshop was thick with dust and the faint scent of oil and aged wood, a silent testament to the years Tian had dedicated to his craft. His fingers moved deftly over the delicate parts, each gear spring and screw a fragment of a world that had been ripped away by the very hands now poised to extinguish any remnant of the old order. In the dim flicker of a guttering candle, his pale face bore the weight of memories sharper than any blade. He could still hear the distant roar of the crowd, the murmuring voices swelling into a crescendo as the executioner's blade fell with cold finality. The guillotine's shadow had cast itself over his childhood, the day his father and friends were taken from him. Their lives severed like the delicate hands of a clock stopped forever. He recalled his father's last words, whispers of hope, and the enduring power of time itself, even as the crowd's cheers drowned them out. The workshop was a refuge, its silence both comforting and oppressive. Tyne had learned to wield his craft, not just as a means of survival, but as an act of defiance. The forbidden clock, hidden beneath a false floorboard, was more than a machine. It was a heartbeat against the relentless march of tyranny, a secret kept alive by trembling hands and desperate hope. His solitude was punctuated by the ghost of loneliness and ache that gnawed beneath the surface. The city outside was a maze of suspicion and fear, where the absence of timepieces had rendered moments indistinguishable, stretching hours into an eternity of dread. Yet within these walls, the ticking persisted, a whisper of resistance that Tyne clung to fiercely. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows over the cobblestones, Tyne stepped cautiously into a narrow alley. There, a figure awaited him, Lucille, her dark hair pulled back, eyes alight with a fire born of grief and determination. Her presence was a fragile thread woven into the fabric of his isolated existence. "They say the streets grow colder," she whispered, her voice low but steady. "But in the cold, we find warmth in each other." Tyne met her gaze, the weight of his past pressing against the fragile hope she offered. Their exchange was brief, a communion of shared pain and purpose, a moment suspended in time like the hidden clock they both guarded. Returning to his sanctuary, Tyn's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the tiny gears within the forbidden clock. Each tick was a vow to remember, to resist, to endure. The shadows of his past no longer solely haunted him. They fueled the quiet rebellion burning beneath his skin. Outside, the city held its breath, caught between the looming spectre of the guillotine and the faint promise of dawn. Tyne, alone but unyielding, listened to the forbidden ticking, a defiant heartbeat in the silence of a world gone mad. As night deepened, he pressed his palm against the worn wood of his workbench, feeling the pulse of the clock beneath the floor. The memories surged, pain and love intertwined, but so did a fragile hope. Perhaps, in this fractured city where time was outlawed, a new destiny awaited. One shaped not by the merciless blade, but by the courage to defy the shadow of the hourglass. And so, with each careful turn of a screw and each whispered promise to the past, Tyn Moreau wove his silent rebellion, a watchmaker bound to the ticking heart of a revolution yet to come. But the streets held their secrets tightly, and the coming days would test the fragile bond between memory and hope, trust and betrayal. For in Paris, under the iron gaze of the guillotine, even the smallest act of defiance was a spark against the dark. He did not yet know how brightly that spark might burn, nor the price it would claim. Yet in the quiet shadows of his workshop, amidst the ticking of a forbidden clock, Tien dared to dream of freedom. The night whispered on, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 silenced moments, and the promise that time, though outlawed, could never be truly erased. The morning light seeped weakly through the grimy panes of my workshop window, casting long, diffused shadows across the scattered tools and wooden benches that filled the cramped room. Outside, the cobblestones of the street were slick with the remnants of a midnight rain, reflecting the muted glow of lanterns hung like watchful eyes along the alley. The city stirred slowly, burdened by the heavy shroud of the reign of terror, where suspicion clung to every breath, and the very notion of time was outlawed as a vestige of the ancient regime. I sat hunched over a battered workbench, my fingers deft and sure despite the chill that gnawed at my bones. Today, like every day, I repaired what little the state allowed: rusted scissors, broken needles, the occasional cracked lens tools deemed necessary for the survival of the new order, yet devoid of the intricate beauty that had once defined my craft. My true skill, the delicate art of timekeeping, remained hidden beneath layers of dust and secrecy. Beneath the floorboards lay the heart of my defiance, the forbidden clock. Its face was unassuming, a simple circle of tarnished brass etched with faint numerals. But its purpose was far from ordinary. It counted down not just seconds, but the approach of a destiny intertwined with the city's fragile future, the return of the guillotine's last victim. Each tick was a whispered rebellion, a heartbeat that pulsed beneath the silence enforced by fear. A sudden, cautious rap at the door startled me. The sound was barely audible, a faint staccato against the stillness. I slipped from my stool, extinguishing the dim candle that had been my sole companion, and moved to the door. Through the crack, a pair of fierce, dark eyes met mine. Lucille's. She slipped inside like a shadow, drawing the door closed behind her with a soft click. "News from the network," she whispered, producing a small folded note from within her worn cloak. Her voice was low, strained with urgency but tempered by the resolve that had become her hallmark. I gestured toward the corner where the forbidden clock lay concealed beneath a loose floorboard. Our meetings were brief, measured, each word weighed against the risk of discovery. With deft fingers, she passed me the note, her eyes flickering toward the window where the street below hummed with the restless footsteps of revolutionary guards. "Dubois has tightened patrols," she murmured, her breath visible in the cold air. "They suspect a hidden network, a spark waiting to ignite. We must be more careful." I nodded, my thoughts racing. Commissaire Dubois was a shadow that loomed ever larger, his cold gaze and relentless pursuit a constant threat to our fragile resistance. He was the embodiment of time's unforgiving march, unyielding, precise and merciless. As Lucille departed into the gathering dusk, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, returning to the hidden clock. Its ticking filled the silence, a steady rhythm that both comforted and tormented me. Time was a paradox, an oppressor that dictated our fates, yet also a beacon of hope that might one day be reclaimed. The day wore on in a haze of muted sounds, the scraping of metal, the whispered exchanges in the marketplace, the distant clang of the guillotine's blade, each a reminder of the precarious existence we led. I repaired what little was permitted, all the while listening for the faintest hint of danger beyond the walls. Later, as night cloaked the city in darkness, I sat by the forbidden clock once more. The ticking was louder now in the stillness, each pulse a defiant heartbeat against the silence imposed by tyranny. My mind wandered to the man whose fate was counted down by this clock, a man whose return might rekindle the flame of liberty or extinguish hope altogether. The question lingered in the air, heavy and unyielding. How long could this fragile rebellion endure beneath the relentless gaze of Commissaire Dubois? How long before time, the very force we sought to defy, would claim us all? But for now, in this fragile moment suspended between fear and courage, the clock ticked on. And so did I. The shadow of the regime lengthened, but within these walls, a quiet defiance persisted, a whispered promise that time, though outlawed, could never be truly silenced. The workshop was cloaked in shadows, save for the faint glow of a single candle flickering against the rough wooden walls. Tian sat hunched over his workbench, the forbidden clock before him, its face both familiar and enigmatic. The ticking steady, insistent was a small rebellion in itself, a heartbeat in the silence imposed by the regime's edicts. He traced his fingers lightly over the clock's glass, feeling the faint ridges of an intricate engraving he had only recently noticed. It was more than a timepiece. It was a vessel of memory, a keeper of secrets that the Republic sought to erase. Lucille's footsteps were cautious as she entered, her dark eyes scanning the room before settling on 10. "Any news?" she whispered, her voice barely above the ticking. Tyne nodded, carefully closing the clock's face and slipping it into his worn leather satchel. "The clock is not merely measuring time," he said. "It is bound to a man, the last condemned by the guillotine, and his return is more than a date. It is a symbol, a chance to defy fate." They moved quickly through the narrow streets, the night thick with the scent of damp stone and distant smoke. Jacques awaited them at their usual meeting place, a narrow alley where shadows clung like cobwebs. His scarred face was grim, eyes sharp and alert. "Dubois's men are tightening their net," Jacques murmured. "If they find the clock, it's over." But there are whispers others who believe in what this clock means, a spark in the dark. Tyne felt the weight of the moment settle around them. The clock was more than a forbidden relic. It was a beacon for those who dared to hope. As Lucille exchanged coded words with Jacques, Tyne's mind raced the identity of the condemned man, the meaning of the countdown, the fragile alliances forged in fear and resolve. Back in his workshop, Tien pored over every detail of the clock. The engravings depicted scenes of revolution and remembrance, faces frozen in time beneath the blade. It was a story carved in metal and glass, a testament to those lost and those yet to rise. The clock's ticking was a defiant whisper against the silence imposed by fear. Time is tyranny, he thought, but also the key. As dawn threatened the horizon, Tyne met Lucille's steady gaze. "We must protect this," he said. "Not just the clock, but what it stands for. The memory of the past and the hope for what's to come." Her nod was firm, unwavering. In that shared resolve, the shadowed streets of Paris seemed a little less suffocating, the guillotine's shadow a little less absolute. The forbidden clock was their silent rebellion, ticking toward an uncertain future, a countdown to defiance. Outside, somewhere beneath the cold stars, the city held its breath, and Tyne listened to the ticking, a fragile heartbeat in the quiet, a promise that even in the darkest hour, time could still be challenged. But as the day would bring new dangers, new betrayals, Tyne knew this secret was both their greatest hope and their gravest peril. The clock's secret was no longer his alone, it was the pulse of a resistance that refused to be silenced. And the hours were running out. The city seemed to hold its breath beneath the relentless grey skies, as if even the heavens recoiled from the unfolding horrors below. I stood among the restless throng gathered at the Place de la Révolution, the cold cobblestones pressing unevenly against my boots. Around me, the murmurs swelled and ebbed like a tide, a sea of faces etched with fear, resignation, and something dangerously close to hope. Above us, the guillotine loomed, a monstrous silhouette carved sharply against the dull light, its blade gleaming faintly, waiting, patient and merciless. I had seen too many of these scenes in recent months, the reign of terror casting its unyielding shadow over our city. The clang of the executioner's axe was a grim metronome for life in Paris, each fall a chilling reminder of the price exacted for defiance. Time itself seemed to slow, the seconds stretching unbearably long as the condemned man stepped forward, his eyes flickering with a desperate plea that no one could answer. Today, the victim was a young man, barely older than myself, accused of conspiring against the Republic. His name was lost to the howling crowd, swallowed by cries of "Vive la République," when the harsh bark of revolutionary guards. The condemned's hands trembled as he was bound to the scaffold, the noose tightening around his neck like a cruel promise. I felt my own heart beat unevenly, the secret clock nestled beneath my coat ticking a rhythm of resistance in defiance of this brutal spectacle. The blade fell with a sickening finality that silenced the square, the sharp crack reverberating through the chill air. A collective gasp rose and died quickly, swallowed by the heavy weight of despair. Yet, amid that silence, a fierce ember ignited within me, a fierce, urgent resolve not to let this darkness consume all light. Later, in the dim sanctuary of my workshop, the air thick with the scent of oil and aged wood, I found Lucille waiting. Her eyes, dark and resolute, held the fierce fire of a spirit unbroken. She pressed a folded note into my palm, her fingers brushing briefly against mine, a small but potent gesture amid the chaos. "We cannot wait," she whispered, voice trembling only slightly. "The network grows restless. The regime tightens its grip, but so do we." Her words were a balm and a challenge. I looked away, to the shadows where the forbidden clock ticked softly, a heartbeat of hope in the suffocating silence. It was more than a timepiece. It was a symbol, a defiant whisper against the tyranny that sought to erase memory and stifle future dreams. As we spoke, the distant echoes of revolutionary drums thrummed through the narrow streets, a reminder that danger lurked near. I thought of Jack's, his scarred face and wary eyes, always perched on the edge between cynicism and cautious hope. I knew he would speak in dark pragmatism, warning of spies and the unrelenting pursuit of Commissaire Dubois. True to form, Jack's appeared as dusk fell, leaning against a crumbling wall, pipe smoke curling like ghostly tendrils in the cold air. His voice was low and gravelly, laced with a bitterness born of survival. "The noose tightens," he said, eyes darting to every shadow. "Dubois is more relentless than ever. Trust no one beyond this circle, Tyne. Betrayal wears many faces." His words settled over me like a shroud, but beneath the weight lay an unspoken call to arms. The dangers multiplied, but so did the necessity of our defiance. The bonds we forged in whispered meetings and stolen moments became lifelines in a world drowning in suspicion and fear. That night, alone in my workshop, I returned my hands to the forbidden clock. Its ticking was a soft, rebellious heartbeat, a steady pulse that defied the silent tyranny imposed on us all. I adjusted its delicate mechanism with trembling fingers, each movement an act of rebellion, each tick a promise that time would not be stolen from us. Outside, Paris slumbered uneasily beneath the guillotine's watchful shadow, unaware that in a small, shadowed room, a young watchmaker dared to defy the relentless march of fate. The road ahead was fraught with peril, but for the first time in many months, I felt the fragile flame of hope flicker defiantly against the darkness. And so, beneath the guillotine's shadow, our story continued, one of resistance, sacrifice, and the unyielding desire for freedom. But even as the forbidden clock ticked on, the question lingered: how far could I go before the shadow consumed us all? The answer awaited in the next heartbeat, the next stolen moment, and I was ready to face it. The workshop lay cloaked in shadows. The faint glow of a single candle casting trembling light over Tian's weathered hands as they hovered hesitantly above the forbidden clock. Its steady ticking, once a quiet pulse of defiance, now felt like a relentless drumbeat in the silence, a countdown not just to fate, but to betrayal. Whispers had reached him, carried on the breath of cautious messengers and hushed voices in the dark corners of Paris. A traitor moved among the resistance, a worm in their fragile garden of hope. The revelation was a knife twisting in his chest, sharper than any blade the guillotine could wield. Trust, once the bedrock of their perilous alliance, now cracked under the weight of suspicion. Tyne's sharp eyes, usually so steady and resolute, flicked anxiously to the door of his workshop. Each creak of the wooden floorboards outside tightened the knot of fear in his stomach. Lucille's recent visit replayed in his mind, her determined gaze, the urgency in her voice as she whispered warnings of compromised safe houses and intercepted messages. He remembered how her fingers had trembled slightly while clutching his arm, a rare crack in her usual steadfast composure. He found her again in the dim haze of a crowded tavern, where the air hung heavy with smoke and the murmur of cautious conversations. Their meeting was brief, charged with a silent understanding that words alone could no longer contain. Lucille's eyes held both fear and fierce resolve mirrored in Tierney's own tightening jaw. "We must be careful," she had urged, voice low yet urgent. "The walls have ears, and the shadow grows longer." The clock ticked on, a steady heartbeat that both comforted and tormented. It was no longer just a measure of time, it was the echo of their dwindling chances. Jax's presence was a difficult comfort. His scarred face emerged from the gloom like a spectre, his wary gaze darting as if expecting an ambush. Their conversation in the narrow alley was fraught with tension, each word weighed against the risk of betrayal. Jax had always walked the razor edge between survival and rebellion, but now that edge seemed perilously thin. Tyne struggled to read his intentions. Was the soldier's cynicism masking loyalty or hiding treachery? "We cannot afford mistakes," Tien whispered, his voice barely audible above the ticking that filled the space between them. "If the commissaire finds the clock," Jax's eyes hardened, "then we are all lost." Outside, Commissaire Dubois lingered like a shadow himself, his cold gaze piercing the darkness as he waited for a sign, the faintest tick, that would betray Tien's secret. His uniform, austere and unyielding, seemed an extension of the unrelenting regime he served. Beneath his stern facade, moments of doubt flickered, but his resolve to crush rebellion never wavered. Inside, Tyne's thoughts raced. The betrayal had shattered the fragile network that protected the forbidden clock, forcing him into a solitude heavier than the night itself. Yet within that isolation, a quiet flame of defiance burned brighter. The clock's ticking was no longer just a countdown. It was a call to arms, a summons to seize what moments remained and shape destiny before time claimed them all. He moved with deliberate care, securing hidden compartments and double-checking secret catches. Each precaution felt like a small victory against the creeping dread that threatened to suffocate them. The moral labyrinth of trust and survival twisted tighter around his heart, pressing him to question even those closest to him. But surrender was not an option. The forbidden clock, with its defiant tick, was more than metal and gears. It was a testament to memory, resistance, and the unyielding will to challenge the shadow of tyranny. As the night deepened, Tyne paused beside the clock, his fingers tracing the cold brass. The ticking seemed to whisper promises of hope amid despair, urging him onward. Outside, the city slumbered uneasily beneath the watchful eyes of the regime, unaware that beneath its streets, a fragile rebellion fought for breath. The betrayal had narrowed their circle of trust, but it had also sharpened their resolve. Tyne knew the path ahead was fraught with peril. Each step forward risked exposure, each breath a gamble against the unforgiving passage of time. Yet, in the quiet turmoil of that shadowed workshop, he vowed to guard the forbidden clock with every ounce of courage he possessed. For in its ticking lay the fragile heartbeat of freedom, and the promise that even in the darkest hour, hope could still endure. A sudden noise at the door made Tien freeze, breath caught in his throat. The ticking seemed to quicken, echoing louder in the stillness. Someone was coming. The moment of reckoning was near, and with it, the fragile balance between survival and defiance would be tested once more. The tavern's air was thick with smoke and whispered secrets, a cacophony of hushed voices drowned beneath the clink of glasses and the distant howls from the streets above. Lucille sat at a scarred wooden table, her dark hair caught loosely in the dim lantern light, eyes burning with a fierce determination that no hardship had managed to extinguish. Around her, a small group of ragged men and women leaned in close, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. She spoke in low tones, outlining routes through the city's labyrinthine alleys and safe houses beneath the noses of the ever-watchful Revolutionary Guards. Each word was weighed with care, each plan a thread in the fragile tapestry of resistance she was weaving. Tyne lingered at the edge of the room, his heart pounding with a mixture of admiration and trepidation. His cautious nature warred with the urgent need to act, but Lucille's courage was a beacon in the darkness that threatened to consume them all. He watched as she moved among the group, her voice steady even when her hands trembled beneath her shawl. Each new alley represented a risk, a potential crack in the fragile shield protecting the forbidden clock he guarded so jealously. Yet it was also a lifeline, a chance to ignite the spark of rebellion that could one day shatter the regime's iron grip. Later, in the sanctity of his workshop, Tyne found a brief moment of reprieve. The soft ticking of the forbidden clock filled the silence between them, a heartbeat of defiance against the relentless passage of time. Lucille's presence was a balm to his weary soul, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight, and something more tender, a promise of something beyond fear and survival. They exchanged hesitant glances, words careful and measured, as if afraid to shatter the fragile connection forming in the shadows. "You are braver than you know," Tyne whispered, his voice barely audible. She smiled, a fleeting warmth that contrasted with the cold world outside. "We must be brave for all who have lost their voices." Their moment was abruptly interrupted by a shadow at the workshop door. Jack stepped inside, his scarred face etched with a wariness born of countless battles, both external and within. His eyes darted suspiciously, weighing the room and its occupants. "We cannot afford mistakes," he said gruffly, his voice a reminder of the ever-present danger lurking in every corner of the city. Tien met his gaze, the tension palpable. Trust was a rare commodity, and Jack's ambiguous loyalties cast a long shadow over their fragile alliance. As the night deepened, Lucille slipped a folded note into Tiny's hand beneath the pale glow of the moon. Their fingers brushed briefly, a fleeting spark of warmth amid the chill of oppression. The note contained directions and coded signals, vital information for the next phase of their resistance. Tyne's heart quickened, not just from the weight of the message, but from the quiet promise in Lucille's eyes. In that moment, amidst the ticking clock and the looming threat of discovery, a fragile light flickered, hope. Yet the path ahead was fraught with peril. Every new alley risked exposure, every whispered plan could unravel their careful work. Tien wrestled with his own fears, torn between the desire to protect the clock and the growing conviction that defiance required sacrifice. Lucille's resolve was infectious, challenging him to step beyond the shadows of caution into the uncertain dawn of rebellion. The chapter closes on Tyne standing at the threshold of his workshop, the city's restless heartbeat echoing around him. The forbidden clock ticks on, a relentless reminder that time is both their enemy and their call to arms. With Lucille's hand intertwined with his own, he steps forward, ready to face whatever dawn brings, fueled by a courage born of love, loss, and unyielding hope. The tavern was a shadowed refuge amid the relentless twilight of Paris, its low ceiling and cramped tables packed with murmurs and the clink of cheap glasses. Jack sat hunched in the corner, his scarred hands wrapped around a chipped cup, the flickering candlelight casting a restless dance of shadows over his rugged face. The air was thick with smoke and secrets, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed upon the small room, like the heavy stone walls themselves. Tyne approached cautiously, his pale eyes narrowing as he took the seat opposite the former soldier. Jack's gaze flickered up, wary and guarded, the flickers of doubt and pain barely concealed beneath the surface. "You wanted to speak," Tien said quietly, the low murmur of voices around them a faint counterpoint to the pounding of his heart. Jax nodded, his voice a rough whisper. "I walk a thin line, Tien, between the Republic's eyes and the shadows that hide us. I give them what they need, but never all. There's a price to pay for survival, and I pay with every breath." Tyne studied him, weighing the truth behind the scars and secrets. The man was a paradox, cynical and pragmatic, yet beneath it all, a flicker of hope that refused to be snuffed out. "And what of your hope?" Tyne pressed. "Does it not invite risk?" Jax's eyes darkened, the flicker of a haunted past surfacing. "Hope is a luxury in these times. But I hold on to it because revenge is patient. It waits for the moment when the scales can be tipped." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden clatter as the door swung open, letting in a cold draft and a pair of revolutionary guards who scanned the room with sharp eyes. Jax tensed but remained still, the practiced calm of a man who had learned to survive under watchful gazes. Later that night, Tan found himself wandering the narrow alleys, the fog curling like ghostly fingers around the cobblestones. The distant clatter of boots and the occasional shout of patrols were constant reminders of the peril that shadowed every step. Jax's words echoed in his mind, the uncertainty gnawing at his resolve. Was the man a friend or a threat? Could the resistance afford the luxury of doubt, or was trust their only weapon against the encroaching darkness? The forbidden clock ticked steadily in his heart, its defiant rhythm a counterpoint to the oppressive silence of the night. Back in the safety of the workshop, Lucille awaited him, her dark eyes sharp and unwavering. "We can't afford shadows, teen," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Jax walks a dangerous path. We need to know where his loyalties truly lie before it's too late." That evening, in a quiet corner filled with the scent of oil and metal, Lucille confronted Jax. Her words were firm but laced with compassion, a plea for truth amid the tangled web of deception. Jax met her gaze steadily, the flickering light of the forbidden clock casting a pale glow that seemed to hold both promise and peril. "I want to believe in your cause," he admitted, "but the chains of my past and the eyes that watch me make every step a gamble. I risk all to keep our hope alive, but the price, it grows heavier every day." The resistance gathered soon after in a cramped room, the air thick with tension and the scent of candle wax. Jax's silence during the meeting was deafening, the unspoken questions pressing down on Tyne and Lucille like a weight, too great to bear. Trust had always been fragile, but now it felt like a thread stretched to its breaking point. As the meeting dispersed, Tyne lingered, his thoughts a storm of doubt and determination. The clock's ticking was a steady reminder that time was slipping away, and with it, the chance to ignite the spark of rebellion. Jax's shadow loomed large, a reminder that survival in this cruel world required sacrifices both seen and hidden. Tien knew one thing with certainty: their fragile alliance would be tested like never before, and the cost of betrayal might be more than any of them could bear. Yet beneath the fear and mistrust, a flicker of hope remained, a stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished, even in the darkest shadow of revolution. The night deepened, and with it, the quiet pulse of defiance that beat within Tiny's heart. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and doubt, but he would walk it still, because the price of silence was far greater than the risk of trust. And so, beneath the weight of shadows and the relentless ticking of a forbidden clock, the story of resistance and redemption continued to unfold, one breath, one secret, and one fragile hope at a time. The hour was late, but the fight was far from over. The tavern's door creaked shut behind him, the cold night swallowing his silhouette as he disappeared into the labyrinth of Parisian streets alone, wary but unyielding. The shadow of Jax lingered, a silent question that refused to fade. In a world ruled by fear, who could one truly trust? The clock ticked on. The muted light of dawn filtered through the grimy window panes of the workshop, casting fractured patterns across the dust-laden wooden floor. I sat hunched over the battered workbench, my fingers trembling only slightly as they fitted the tiny cogwheel into place. Beside me, Henry watched with wide, eager eyes, his youthful face illuminated by the faint glow of the oil lamp that flickered against the encroaching grey morning. "Steady now," I whispered, guiding his unsteady hands. "The mechanism must breathe, not choke. Each part moves in harmony, like the pulse of a heart." Henry nodded solemnly, his lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. The innocence in his gaze was a stark contrast to the harsh world that pressed against the fragile walls of our sanctuary. He was but a boy, yet in his hands lay the fragile hope that the future might yet be redeemed from the shadows of the past. Madame Fournier was already stirring in the back room, her footsteps muffled but purposeful. She had taken to watching over us with a protective vigilance that belied her quiet demeanor. I could hear the faint clinking of teacups and the rustle of worn fabric as she prepared a meager breakfast. The shop was more than a place of work. It was a refuge, a bastion against the relentless tide of suspicion and fear that swept through Paris. Henry's apprenticeship had begun months ago, a cautious decision born of necessity and hope. The boy's father had vanished in the early days of the Terror, leaving Henry adrift in a sea of uncertainty. It was Madame Fournier who had brought him to me, pressing his small, trembling hands into mine and urging me to teach him the craft that had once been my family's legacy. "You must be careful," I warned him during one of our first sessions, the memory sharp and bitter. "The regime hunts those who remember the old ways. Timepieces are forbidden, a symbol of the privilege they seek to erase. But in these small gears and springs lies a rebellion more profound than any shouted slogan." Henry listened, absorbing my words with a seriousness that both warmed and saddened me. His youth was a rare bloom in these dark times, a fragile light flickering against the gathering storm. That afternoon, Madame Fournier summoned me quietly to the front of the shop. Her face was drawn, eyes shadowed with worry. "Guards have been patrolling more frequently," she murmured, glancing toward the street. "They linger longer near the workshops. We must be cautious." I nodded, the weight of her words settling heavy in my chest. The forbidden clock, the very heartbeat of our resistance, rested hidden behind a false panel in the back room. Its silent, defiant ticking was the pulse of hope amid despair. Yet with each passing day, the danger grew and the walls seemed to close in. That evening, Henry and I shared a simple meal by candlelight. The flickering flame cast long shadows across the worn wooden table, the silence between us filled with unspoken dreams and fears. "Do you think there will be a day when we can tell time without fear?" Henry asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled faintly, the corners of my mouth aching with the weight of years. "I believe there will be," I said. "But it will be a day forged from courage and sacrifice, a day when we refuse to be prisoners of the hourglass." As the candle guttered low, a sudden knock at the door startled us. Lucille slipped inside, her dark eyes sharp with urgency. "The patrols are tightening," she said, breathless. "We must be ready." The fragile piece of our refuge shattered like glass. I met Henry's gaze, seeing in his youthful eyes the dawning understanding of the peril that surrounded us. Yet beneath the fear there was a spark, an unyielding hope that the craft of watchmaking, the defiance of time itself, might yet endure. "Prepare yourself," I whispered, steeling my voice against the tremor of dread. "The night is long, and our fight has only just begun." Outside, the city held its breath, caught between the ticking silence of forbidden clocks and the distant echo of a future waiting to be claimed. And so, beneath the weight of oppression and the shadow of the guillotine, a young apprentice learned not only the delicate art of watchmaking, but the quiet rebellion of hope, a hope that, even in the darkest hour, the hands of time could be turned toward freedom. The workshop door closed softly behind Lucille, and the ticking continued, a heartbeat against the silence, a promise that time, though outlawed, was not yet conquered. In the days that followed, I watched Henry grow steadier, his hands more confident as he mastered the intricate dance of gears and springs. Each watch we repaired, each secret clock we tended, was a thread woven into the tapestry of resistance. Madame Fournier's watchful gaze never wavered, her presence a shield as much as any weapon. Yet danger lurked in every shadow. The city was a cage tightening with every patrol, every whispered denunciation. The faces of those lost haunted my dreams, their silent cries a constant reminder of the cost of defiance. One evening, as Henry carefully polished a newly repaired pocket watch, he turned to me with a question that pierced the gloom. "Why do you risk so much for these clocks, Tien? What do they mean to you?" I paused, the weight of years pressing upon my shoulders. "Because they are more than machines," I said slowly. "They are the memory of those who came before us, the heartbeat of a past that must not be forgotten. They are the promise of a future where men are not bound by the tyranny of time, but masters of their own fate." Henry nodded, absorbing the gravity of my words. In that moment, I saw not just an apprentice before me, but the fragile hope of a people yearning to reclaim their freedom. Our quiet resolve was tested again when Lucille returned with news of increased arrests and a tightening noose around the underground networks. Fear whispered through the city like a poison, but it also steeled our determination. In the sanctuary of the workshop, we vowed to protect the forbidden clock and the legacy it carried. Henry, once a boy lost to the terror, now stood as a symbol of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of hope even as the shadows lengthened. As I watched him, I knew the path ahead was fraught with peril. Yet in his eyes, I glimpsed a future unshackled from fear, a world where time could once again be counted freely. The clock ticked softly in the back room, its steady rhythm a defiant heartbeat against the silence. And in that sound, I found the courage to carry on. The war for freedom was far from over, but with Henry by my side, and the memory of those lost etched into every gear and spring, I believed just barely that the light of hope might yet break through the darkest night. The chapter closes as the city sleeps uneasily beneath the watchful gaze of the Revolutionary Guards, and I, Tien Moreau, prepare to teach the next lesson not just of watchmaking, but of courage, endurance, and the fragile power of time itself. The ticking will continue. We must ensure it does. And tomorrow the fight begins anew. The workshop was cloaked in its usual shroud of muted shadows, the faint glow of a single candle flickering against the aged wooden walls. Tyne sat hunched over the forbidden clock, his fingers trembling slightly as he traced the delicate engravings on its surface. The clock was unlike any other relic that had survived the regime's ruthless purges, its ticking a whispered rebellion in a city where time itself was outlawed. For weeks, Tyne had been consumed with an obsession that bordered on desperation. The secret he suspected was hidden within the very heart of the clock. Tonight, the air seemed charged with a quiet urgency, the oppressive silence of Paris pressing against the small shop's fragile walls. Carefully, Tian lifted the clock's face, revealing a labyrinth of gears and cogs, each one humming faintly as if alive. His skilled hands searched for any anomaly, any hidden mechanism that might betray the clock's deeper secret. Then, beneath the main gear assembly, his fingers found a nearly imperceptible seam. With deliberate care, he pried open a concealed compartment. A soft scrape of metal against wood echoed softly in the stillness. Inside lay a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age, and sealed with crimson wax bearing an unfamiliar insignia. Tyen's heart pounded as he broke the seal, unfolding the letter with reverence and trepidation. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink smudged in places as if written in haste and fear. Tyen's eyes skimmed the words, absorbing the name that leapt from the page, a name he had only heard whispered in shadows, Armand Lacroix. Armand Lacroix, the last condemned man the clock counted down to. The letter told of his innocence, a secret kept by a network of sympathizers, risking everything to preserve his memory. It spoke of a man unjustly sentenced, a symbol of the old world's cruelty and the new world's hope. Tyne leaned back, the candlelight casting flickering shadows on his pale face, as the weight of the revelation settled deep in his chest. The clock was far more than a mere timepiece. It was a beacon of resistance, a testament to a man whose fate was entwined with the very soul of Paris. The quiet knock at the door startled him. Lucille slipped inside, her dark eyes sharp and filled with the fierce compassion Tien had come to depend upon. "Did you find something?" she whispered, moving closer to the table. Without words, Tyne handed her the letter. Together, they read the secret testimony aloud, their voices low but resolute. Outside, the distant clatter of boots and the murmurs of the fearful city reminded them of the stakes. "This changes everything," Lucille breathed. Armand's story. It must be told. Their shared resolve ignited a fragile flame of hope amid the encroaching darkness. Before they could speak further, the door creaked open again. Jack stepped inside, his rugged face etched with fatigue and suspicion. "I heard whispers," he said. eyes darting around the cramped workshop. The commissaire's men are tightening their nets. This letter, if discovered, could mean doom for us all. Tyne met his gaze steadily. We knew the risks. But the truth must be protected. Jax nodded reluctantly, the tension between caution and defiance crackling like static in the air. As they secured the letter back inside its hidden compartment, the clock's ticking seemed to swell, each beat a drum of resistance against the relentless march of tyranny. Tyne stood by the window, gazing out as the city slept uneasily beneath a sky heavy with foreboding. The secret beneath the clock was no longer just his burden. It was the spark that could kindle a revolution. But time was running out, and with every tick, the shadow of the guillotine drew nearer. The flickering candlelight cast long, trembling shadows against the worn wooden walls of my workshop, where Lucille and I gathered once more to weave the fragile strands of our resistance into a tapestry strong enough to confront the relentless tide of tyranny. The air was thick with the scent of oil and wood shavings, mingling with the faint, defiant ticking of the forbidden clock hidden beneath the floorboards, a heartbeat against the silence imposed by the guillotine's shadow. Lucille's dark eyes burned with quiet fire as she traced rotes on the faintly drawn maps spread across the workbench. "The couriers are ready," she whispered, her voice steady despite the peril that clung to every word. But Dubois tightens his noose. The streets grow less safe by the hour. I nodded, my fingers absently brushing the edge of the clock's concealed casing. Each tick was a reminder not just of the passing moments, but of the defiance we embodied. "We must move swiftly," I replied, "but with care. The last thing we need is to lose what little we have built." Outside, the city of Paris throbbed with unrest. The clang of boots on cobblestones echoed like a drumbeat of oppression, and the distant cries of the condemned wove through the narrow alleys like a mournful dirge. Yet beneath the weight of fear, a pulse of hope beat steadily in the hearts of those who dared to oppose the regime. Lucille slipped from the workshop as dusk bled into night, her figure swallowed by the fog that crept like a living thing over the city. I watched her disappear into the labyrinth of streets, carrying with her the fragile hopes of many. She was our messenger, our shield, the quiet courage that kept the flame flickering in the darkness. Hours later, the alleyways seemed empty save for the whispers of the night. Yet Lucille's presence was felt in the furtive exchanges beneath gas lamps, where trusted hands received folded notes sealed with the Resistance's mark. The scent of damp stone and burning wood mingled with the hushed breath of those who dared to dream of freedom. Meanwhile, Commissaire Dubois prowled the corridors of power with an unyielding gaze. His silhouette, dark and imposing, was a constant reminder of the regime's iron grip. Reports of clandestine meetings and suspicious movements were laid before him like weapons waiting to be wielded. His cold eyes lingered over a crude sketch of my face, a mark that tied me irrevocably to the growing storm. His mind churned with ruthless calculation. "Order must be maintained," he muttered, the words a mantra to steel his resolve. Yet beneath the stern veneer, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him, a whisper that perhaps even the hardest steel could be bent by the tides of change. In the shadowed corners of a tavern far from the prying eyes of the revolutionaries, Jax and I met under the cloak of night. His rugged face bore the scars of battles past, and his eyes flickered with a mix of cynicism and reluctant hope. Our conversation was a dance of half-truths and veiled warnings, each word weighed against the cost of trust in a world rife with betrayal. "They watch closer now," Jax warned, his voice low. "Dubois is no fool. Every move we make risks everything." "Then we must be smarter," I replied. "For if we falter, the silence will consume us all." The resistance was no longer a whispered secret, it had become a living force, pulsing with the courage of those who refused to bow. Yet with every step forward, the shadow of danger grew longer. The forbidden clock's ticking was a reminder that time was both our enemy and our ally. It counted down not only the moments left for the last victim of the guillotine, but also the fleeting window for us to ignite the spark of rebellion. As the night deepened, I found myself returning to the clock. Its steady rhythm was a balm to my restless spirit, a whispered promise that the fight was not in vain. Somewhere within its mechanism lay the hope that memory and resistance could outlast even the harshest tyranny. But the question lingered like a cold breath against my neck: how long before the relentless gaze of Commissaire Dubois closed around us? How long before the fragile network we had woven unraveled into silence? In the heart of Paris, beneath the ever-watchful eyes of the regime, our story continued, etched in the ticking of a forbidden clock, in the bravery of a seamstress, in the wary glances of a scarred soldier, and in the quiet resolve of a watchmaker who dared to hold time itself at bay. The night was far from over, and the network was tightening, but so too was our resolve. The night pressed down upon Paris like a suffocating shroud, the narrow streets swallowed by a fog heavier than the chill in the air. In the cramped safe house where we gathered, the faint light of a single candle flickered against the peeling plaster walls, casting long, trembling shadows. I sat hunched over the forbidden clock, my fingers tracing its delicate mechanisms, each tick a quiet rebellion in the oppressive silence that had come to define our lives. Lucille's voice was barely above a whisper as she relayed the latest word from the underground. Dubois's men are growing restless. They search harder, ask sharper questions. Tonight, the noose tightens. Her eyes, dark and fierce, met mine with a mixture of resolve and fear. I nodded, the weight of our secret pressing heavily on my shoulders. The clock was more than a timepiece. It was a testament to our defiance, a heartbeat of hope counting down to a fate intertwined with freedom itself. To lose it now would be to surrender the fragile spark we carried within us. Suddenly, the muffled sound of boots echoed down the street, a harsh staccato that shattered the fragile calm. My heart lurched. Lucille froze, her hand instinctively reaching for a hidden dagger beneath her cloak. I scrambled to my feet, the clock clutched tightly in my hands. The door burst open with a violent crash. Revolutionary guards flooded the room, their faces set in grim determination. Commissaire Dubois himself stepped forward, tall and imposing, his cold gaze sweeping over us like a winter gale. "Search the premises," he commanded, voice as hard as the steel of his blade. No corner left unturned. Time slowed as panic and calculation warred within me. The forbidden clock, our secret, could not be found. I had to act. With trembling hands, I began to disassemble the clock, a practiced motion born of countless hours in my workshop. Lucille moved silently to the window, peering through the shutters as the guards advanced, their boots scraping against the worn floorboards. Jacques, ever the pragmatist, engaged the guards' intense conversation, his voice low and measured. I caught snippets, questions about contraband, whispers of betrayal, threats veiled beneath polite words. As I hid the clock's components beneath loose floorboards, each piece a fragment of our fragile hope, the room seemed to close in around us. Sweat trickled down my spine, my breath shallow. The guards' search was thorough, their hands overturning crates, rifling through cupboards. Dubois' gaze lingered on me, sharp and unyielding. A bead of sweat traced my temple as I met his stare, refusing to betray what lay beneath my feet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guards withdrew, their footsteps receding into the foggy night. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the faint, imagined ticking of the concealed clock. We exhaled collectively, relief washing over us but tempered by the knowledge that the danger was far from over. Trust, once solid, now felt fragile and fractured. Whispers of betrayal gnawed at our resolve. Lucille's hand found mine, a silent promise amidst the shadows. "We survived tonight," she said. "But the fight has just begun." In the quiet that followed, I allowed myself a moment to listen to the silence, to the echo of footsteps fading into the night, and to the relentless, defiant heartbeat of a clock that would soon mark the turning of fate itself. The night was a reckoning, a test of courage and cunning. And as dawn approached, I knew that the shadows of Paris held secrets deeper than any guillotine's blade, and that our resistance, fragile as it was, had been forged anew in fire and fear. The fragile parchment trembled slightly between my fingers as the candle's flame flickered, casting long, wavering shadows against the cluttered walls of my workshop. Each word held the weight of 1,000 silenced voices, a testament to a life extinguished too soon, yet refusing to be forgotten. I traced the faded ink with trembling fingertips. The secret letter concealed within the forbidden clock, revealing the story of the man whose fate had become entwined with ours, whose final moments were a defiant echo against the oppressive silence that had fallen over Paris. It was late, the city outside wrapped in a suffocating stillness, as if time itself dared not breathe beneath the iron grip of the reign of terror. The absence of clocks was a constant, haunting reminder. To measure moments was to acknowledge a past the new order wished erased. Yet here I sat, treasuring this relic that ticked in the shadows, its hidden heart beating in secret defiance. The letter told of a man once ordinary, a craftsman like myself, whose hands had shaped beauty from metal and glass. But his true legacy was forged not in clocks or watches, but in his courage, the courage to stand against an unjust fate when the blade fell and the crowd's murmur rose to a roar. His words, penned in hurried script, spoke of hope, of resistance, of the power of memory to shape a future where liberty might yet bloom. I read and reread those words, each sentence a balm and a blade. The story was not just of a condemned soul, but a symbol, a beacon for those of us who dared to remember. The past, I realized, was not a weight to crush us, but a foundation upon which to build. Even as the guillotine's shadow stretched long and dark, the light of memory flickered stubbornly in the hearts of the oppressed. A soft knock drew me from my reverie. The door creaked open to reveal Lucille's familiar silhouette, her dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp and steady despite the wariness that clung to us all. She slipped inside, the faint scent of the streets clinging to her like a second skin. "You found it," she whispered, her voice a thread of warmth in the cold gloom. I nodded, unfolding the letter once more, careful not to tear its fragile edges. His story, it's more than I imagined. He was like us, an ordinary man who chose to resist. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her resolve was clear. We carry his memory now. It's why we fight not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot. The silence between us was heavy yet charged, a shared understanding binding us tighter than any spoken vow. This letter was not merely a secret, it was a call to action, a testament to the unyielding spirit that could not be crushed even by the relentless march of time. Before I could respond, a sudden noise at the door alerted us. Jax stood there, his scarred face drawn tight with tension, eyes flickering with the unease that shadowed every step he took these days. "Dubois has increased patrols. He's sniffing closer," he said grimly. "We must be more careful." Lucille's hand moved instinctively to the small dagger at her waist, her stance tightening like a coiled spring. I felt the weight of his warning settle over us, a chilling reminder that our defiance was a fragile flame in a storm of steel and suspicion. Yet, even as fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve, the letter remained a steady pulse beneath my skin, a heartbeat of hope in the dark. I looked once more at the faded script, at the words that bridged past and present, and understood that memory was our fiercest weapon. To forget would be to surrender, but to remember was to resist. Later, when the night deepened and Lucille and Jax had slipped away to their dangerous tasks, I stood by the window, gazing over the rooftops of a city cloaked in shadows. The distant sounds of footsteps and whispered secrets carried on the chill wind. Below, the silent streets seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable reckoning. The forbidden clock ticked beneath the floorboards, a soft, steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat against the cold void. It marked not just the passage of time, but the persistence of those who dared to defy its tyranny. In that moment, I understood the paradox that had haunted me since childhood. Time could never be truly owned or controlled, but memory could outlast even the sharpest blade. The weight of memory pressed upon me not as a burden, but as a mantle. The story of the condemned man was now ours to carry. His fate was a mirror reflecting our own struggles, fears, and hopes. And as the city slept uneasily under the guillotine's shadow, I vowed to guard his legacy with every breath. Tomorrow, the fight would continue, fiercer and more perilous than ever. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of my workshop, surrounded by the whispering ghosts of the past, I found a fragile peace. The past was alive within me, a flame that could not be snuffed out by fear or time. And so, as the candle guttered and the night deepened, I listened to the clock's forbidden tick, each pulse a promise that we would remember, resist, and rise again. But even as hope flickered, a shadow loomed on the horizon, and I knew that the coming days would test the limits of our courage. Would memory be enough to sustain us when the hour of reckoning struck, or would the relentless march of time crush us all beneath its unforgiving heel? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, in the dark heart of a city waiting to awaken, and I, Tyne Moreau, would be there to meet it. The rain fell in relentless sheets over Paris that evening, turning the cobblestone streets into rivers of slick, glistening stone. I pressed my back against the cold brick of my workshop, heart pounding against my ribs like a frantic clockwork mechanism. The city around me was suffocating beneath the shadow of the reign of terror, and the silence was broken only by the distant, cruel clang of the guillotine's blade, a grim metronome measuring out the lives snuffed out in the name of the Republic. I dared not move, my breath shallow, as the heavy boots of revolutionary guards echoed near. Commissaire Dubois was drawing closer still, his presence a dark tide slowly engulfing the fragile sanctuary of my secret. I could feel his gaze, cold and unyielding, like the steel of the very blades he so faithfully served. He was a man forged in the fires of conviction, and yet, beneath that austere exterior, I sensed a flicker of something else, doubt, perhaps, or the faintest whisper of regret. Earlier that day, whispers in the underground had reached my ears. Dubois was more relentless than ever, his squads scouring every corner where hope dared to hide. Lucille had come by, her dark eyes sharp and resolute beneath the humble guise of a seamstress. She brought news, her voice low and urgent as we exchanged messages cloaked in coded words. Jacques, ever the cynic, lingered in the shadows, his scarred face taut with tension. His allegiance was a fragile thread, stretched thin between survival and the thirst for vengeance. I returned to my workbench, fingers trembling as I adjusted the delicate gears of the forbidden clock. Its ticking was a lifeline, a defiant heartbeat against the silent tyranny that sought to erase time itself. Each tick was a whisper of rebellion, a promise that fate was not yet sealed. Meanwhile, Dubois sat alone in his quarters, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the cracked mirror before him. His reflection was a harsh reminder of the man he had become, a guardian of order at a terrible cost. His jaw clenched as memories surfaced unbidden, faces of the innocent lost, the weight of sacrifices made in the name of a fragile peace. Yet his resolve remained ironclad. The Republic's survival demanded sacrifice, no matter how bitter. As night deepened, the city seemed to hold its breath. I heard the distant murmurs of voices, the hurried steps of those who dared to defy the regime. Lucille and Jacques met in a quiet tavern, their whispered plans weaving threads of hope amid the ever-tightening web of danger. Their courage was a fragile flame, flickering but unextinguished. The tension coiled tighter within me. Each moment was a fragile balance between defiance and despair. The clock ticked on, a silent sentinel counting down not just minutes, but the fragile chances left to us all. Dubois's pursuit was no mere hunt. It was a battle of wills, a clash between the unyielding force of time and the stubborn human spirit that dared to challenge it. And beneath his stern gaze, I sensed the cracks of a man wrestling with the cost of his own righteousness. Tonight, beneath the relentless gaze of Commissaire Dubois, the fate of us all hung in the balance, measured not by the passing of hours, but by the courage to defy the shadow of time itself. The night held its secrets close, but the dawn would come, and with it, the reckoning. The air in my workshop was thick with the scent of oil and metal, the faint ticking of the forbidden clock steady yet somehow louder than usual. It was as if the very heartbeat of our resistance pulsed in that delicate mechanism hidden away from prying eyes, a secret sanctuary amid the storm of the reign of terror. Tonight, the shadows seemed to press closer, their darkness heavier than ever before. A letter had arrived, carried by Lucille's swift hands, and its contents gnawed at my resolve like a relentless rat. The message was brief but devastating. One among us had betrayed our cause. The words burned through me, scorching the fragile trust we had painstakingly built. Betrayal was a poison far worse than the guillotine's blade. It threatened not only our lives, but the very spark of hope that the forbidden clock represented. I stood motionless, fingers brushing the worn brass casing of the clock, its ticking a cruel reminder of the time slipping away. I knew the risk of suspicion that had always lurked in the corners of our gatherings. Fear twisted the hearts of men and women, turning friends into shadows of doubt. But now the betrayal was no longer a whisper, it was a cold, hard truth that demanded action. I could not afford the luxury of paralysis. The resistance depended on my decision. The clock's secret was too precious to be lost to recklessness. I summoned Jax to meet me in the courtyard behind the workshop. The night wrapped around us like a shroud as I waited, heart hammering against my ribs with a mixture of dread and determination. When he arrived, his rugged face was etched with a wariness that spoke of battles fought both within and without. The scars that marred his skin told stories of survival, but his eyes, those guarded, watchful eyes, held deeper secrets. "Jax," I began, my voice low but steady. "There are whispers, darker than before. I need to know, are you one of them?" He met my gaze without flinching, the flicker of lantern light casting long shadows that danced across his face. "You think I would betray you? After all we've been through." "I cannot afford doubt," I replied. "Not now. The clock's time is running out, and every second stolen by betrayal tightens the noose around us." His silence was a heavy weight, broken only by the distant clatter of boots, revolutionary guards prowling the streets, relentless in their hunt for dissent. The tension between us was a fragile thread stretched taut, threatening to snap. Elsewhere, Lucille moved like a shadow herself, weaving through the labyrinthine alleys with purposeful speed. Her breath fogged the cold night air as she delivered urgent warnings, her dark eyes blazing with fierce loyalty. She carried not only messages, but the collective hope of those who dared to dream of freedom. Her courage was a beacon, cutting through the despair that threatened to engulf us all. Back in the dim light of the workshop, I sat alone beside the hidden clock. Its ticking echoed in the silence like a metronome, marking the rhythm of my thoughts, each beat a reminder of the impossible choices before me. To expose the traitor was to risk fracturing our fragile alliance. To remain silent was to court destruction. The cost of resistance was no longer abstract. It was a knife pressed against the throat of our cause. I traced the delicate hands of the clock, feeling their cold, unyielding presence. Could I protect the greater good without sacrificing the humanity that bound us? This question haunted me, a specter at the crossroads of fear and hope. The night deepened, and with it, the weight of my decision. The city outside held its breath, caught between the tyranny of the present and the promise of a future yet unwritten. In the heart of that darkness, I resolved to act not as a survivor clinging to shadows, but as a man willing to face the dawn, however uncertain its light might be. The forbidden clock would keep ticking, so would I, and when the time came to unveil its secret, we would be ready. The shadows in my workshop seemed to deepen, pressing in like the very night itself had taken refuge within these walls. I sat at the worn wooden bench, fingers trembling as they hovered over the delicate hands of the forbidden clock. This clock, my secret heartbeat amid the silence of repression, ticked softly but defiantly, a metronome counting down not just minutes or hours, but the fragile hope for freedom. The metallic click of each tick resonated in the stillness, a whispered rebellion against the tyrannical silence that had fallen over Paris. I leaned closer, eyes narrowing as I adjusted the minute hand. The countdown was in its final hours. Every second was a stolen breath, a stolen moment of courage, a defiance of the inexorable decree imposed by Commissaire Dubois and his merciless guards. The city outside seemed to hold its breath too, caught in the suffocating grip of fear. Yet within me, a spark glowed brighter than ever. This was the moment to act. A sudden, soft knock at the door startled me. The familiar figure of Lucille slipped through the shadowed threshold, her dark hair barely visible under a worn hood. Her eyes, fierce and unwavering, met mine in silence. We had little time. The plan we had woven through whispered meetings and coded messages was about to unfold. "They are tightening their patrols," Lucille murmured, her voice low, eyes darting toward the street beyond the window. "Dubois is hunting for any sign of the clock. We must move swiftly." I nodded, swallowing the knot of fear that threatened to choke me. The people need to see it, to know the time has not been erased. Her hand brushed mine briefly, a silent promise in the cold air. Later that evening, we met in the narrow alleyways where the city's pulse was faint but persistent. The smell of damp stone and burning tallow mingled as Lucille and I exchanged hurried instructions beneath the flickering glow of a lone lantern. Our voices were hushed, yet each word carried the weight of desperate hope. Jax appeared from the shadows, his scarred face etched with tension. "Dubois patrols will sweep the eastern quarters twice before midnight," he reported, voice clipped. "We have a narrow window." His presence was a double-edged sword, an ally whose loyalty was as uncertain as the future itself. As the forbidden hour approached, we made our way to the central square, the very heart of the city's oppression. The streets were eerily silent, save for the distant murmur of guards and the soft hum of restless whispers from hidden watchers. I carried the clock, its face faintly illuminated by a concealed candle. The ticking, once muffled by walls and shadows, now dared to challenge the silence of the terror-stricken night. "Remember," I whispered to Lucille, "this is more than a clock. It is a voice, a symbol. We defy the erasure of time, the erasure of memory." We placed the clock atop the fountain's edge, its ticking drawing curious glances from those who dared peek from behind shuttered windows. A murmur grew, a ripple of recognition, of hope. Suddenly a shout pierced the night. "Seize them!" The sharp voice of a guard cut through the air. Commissaire Dubois himself emerged, his cold gaze fixed upon us like the blade of the guillotine. The forbidden hour had arrived. Fear surged, but so did resolve. The people stirred, emboldened by the defiant ticking that refused to be silenced. In that moment, I understood the paradox of time. It was both our oppressor and our greatest weapon. The battle for memory and freedom had begun anew, and though the outcome was uncertain, the spark was lit. The clock's hands moved inexorably forward, but in this hour we chose to fight against the shadow it cast. As guards closed in, Lucille grasped my arm. "No matter what happens," she said, "this hour will be remembered." And in the depths of my soul, I believed her. The forbidden hour was upon us, and with it, the fragile light of hope flickered fiercely in the darkness. The air in the workshop was thick with tension, suffused by the faint, relentless ticking of the forbidden clock, a sound that Tyne had come to equate with the fragile pulse of hope itself. But now that pulse seemed to falter, as if the very heartbeat of their rebellion was under siege. Jacques' words hung heavily between them, whispered in the shadows but sharp as a blade. "Tian," he had said, his voice rough and uncertain, "I have betrayed you. The guards are coming, they know about the clock." For a moment, Tyne felt the room spin, the walls closing in with the weight of disbelief. Jacques, the man whose cynicism often clashed with his quiet hope, had crossed a line no one dared approach. The betrayal was a wound deeper than any blade, slicing through the fabric of trust they had painstakingly woven. Why? Tyner's voice was barely audible, a brittle thread in the silence. Jax looked away, the scars on his face seeming to deepen with shame. I did what I thought was necessary to survive. The regime's grip tightens. I feared for my life, for all of us. The words stung, but beneath the pain simmered a grudging understanding. Survival was a cruel currency in these times, often exacted at the expense of loyalty and love. Tian paced the length of his workshop, the worn floorboards creaking beneath his steps. Each tick of the clock seemed to echo louder, a defiant call amidst encroaching darkness. He glanced at the hidden compartment housing the clock, now a fragile secret threatened by exposure. The betrayal had not only endangered the clock, but threatened the very soul of their resistance. The underground network they had nurtured with care was fracturing, suspicion poisoning their once unshackable bonds. Lucille arrived shortly after, her footsteps muffled by the night but her presence as vivid as a flame. Her face was pale, eyes shining with unshed tears and unwavering determination. "Tyne," she whispered fiercely, "we cannot let this break us. The clock is more than a mechanism, it is our symbol, our defiance. We must stand firm." Her words stirred something within him. A flicker of the courage he feared was extinguished. The fragile bond between them, forged in whispered hopes and shared dangers, anchored him. But the threat loomed large. Commissaire Dubois, the embodiment of the regime's unforgiving will, was already mobilizing. From his vantage point high above the city, his cold gaze swept the labyrinthine streets, locking onto Tyne's workshop as the epicenter of rebellion. Dubois's mind was a machine of ruthless calculation. He believed in order, in the absolute necessity of erasing the past to build the future. Yet, beneath his stern exterior, doubt gnawed at him. Was the cost of this control worth the human suffering? The question haunted him in the silent watches of the night. Back in the workshop, Tian sat alone, the clock's ticking now a hollow echo as its mechanism lay still. He cradled the silent timepiece, the weight of betrayal and loss pressing down like the Parisian fog that crept through the narrow streets. Yet, within the depths of grief, a new fire kindled. The betrayal, though bitter, had laid bare the stakes. The fight was no longer just about survival, but about reclaiming their stolen time and memories. Tyne's resolve hardened. He would not allow Jax's treachery to extinguish the fragile light they had kindled. For Lucille, for Henry, for the city gasping under the guillotine's shadow, he would rise again. The betrayal unveiled more than danger. It revealed the true cost of defiance and the unyielding spirit needed to confront it. As the first light of dawn touched the rooftops, Tian prepared to face the storm not as a broken man, but as a beacon of resistance in the encroaching night. The time for silence had ended. The clock's defiant heartbeat, though muted for now, would soon ring out once more, heralding a reckoning that could not be silenced. The night was thick with tension, the kind that settles deep in the bones, heavy and unyielding. In the dim confines of my workshop, the flicker of a lone candle cast long shadows across the walls, dancing over scattered papers, maps, and the forbidden clock resting silently between my trembling hands. Lucille sat opposite me, her dark eyes sharp with resolve, scanning the coded messages that had arrived just hours before. The ticking of the clock, so defiant in its persistence, filled the room like a heartbeat steady, unrelenting, a whisper against the silence the regime demanded. "It's almost time," I murmured, voice barely audible. "If we wait any longer, the man's fate will be sealed forever." Lucille nodded, her fingers tightening around a folded note. "The network is ready. Jax has gathered the men. Tonight, we strike." The plan was perilous. To reveal the forbidden clock publicly was to paint a target on our backs, to invite the full wrath of Commissaire Dubois and his guards. Yet the alternative, silence, submission, the slow death of hope, was a sentence far worse. The clock was more than a mechanism. It was a symbol, a beacon of defiance against the relentless oppression that sought to erase not only time but memory itself. Outside, the streets of Paris lay shrouded in fog, the gas lamps casting halos of dim light that barely penetrated the darkness. I wrapped my worn cloak tighter, the fabric thin but familiar. Lucille's hand found mine, a brief anchor before we slipped into the night. Jax awaited us near the old mill, his scarred face set in a grim mask. "The men are ready," he said, voice low. "Commissaire Dubois has doubled patrols, but there's a gap just before dawn. That's when we move." The small band of rebels, faces marked by fear and fierce determination, gathered silently. Each carried the weight of personal loss, memories of loved ones taken by the guillotine's blade, fueling the fire burning within them. Among them, Henry's youthful eyes shone with a mixture of hope and terror, the next generation standing on the brink of change. We moved like shadows through the labyrinth of alleys, the city's pulse quickening with the approach of dawn. Our destination was the public square, where the condemned man was to meet his fate. The crowd was already gathering, a sea of faces etched with dread and resignation, the oppressive silence punctuated only by the distant clang of the guillotine. Hidden beneath my cloak, the forbidden clock ticked steadily, its presence both a comfort and a challenge. To many, time was a tool of tyranny, an instrument to measure out life until the inevitable end. But to us, it was a weapon, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, the spark of rebellion could not be silenced. As the executioner's hooded figure emerged, a murmur rippled through the crowd. I caught Lucille's eye, her lips pressed into a determined line. This was the moment, the spark we had dared to ignite. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air. From the shadows, Jax and the rebels surged forward, their shouts slicing through the silence like blades. The guards scrambled, muskets raised, but the element of surprise was ours. Chaos erupted, a clash of wills and weapons, the square alive with the fury of desperate men and women fighting for a sliver of freedom. I moved swiftly, heart pounding, as I made my way to the scaffold. The condemned man, gaunt and pale, turned his eyes to me, a silent plea, a shared understanding. With trembling hands, I revealed the forbidden clock, its ticking a bold declaration against the regime's cruelty. "Time has not forgotten you," I whispered, voice steady despite the storm around us, "and neither have we." The guards closed in, muskets firing, but the crowd's momentum surged like a tide. For a fleeting moment, the city held its breath, suspended between past horrors and the fragile promise of dawn. The battle was fierce, and the cost was heavy. Friends fell, and hope threatened to flicker out amid the smoke and blood. Yet, in that crucible of fear and defiance, a new fire was kindled, one that no guillotine, no regime could fully extinguish. As the first rays of morning pierced the gloom, I realized that the spark we had ignited was more than a fleeting act of rebellion. It was the beginning of a story that would outlast us all, a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who dare to defy the shadow of time. But as the dust settled and the echoes of battle faded, a question lingered in my mind, heavy as the silence that followed. Could this fragile flame truly grow into a revolution, or would the relentless march of tyranny snuff it out before it had a chance to burn? The answer, I knew, lay not in the clock's ticking, but in the hearts of those willing to fight for the freedom it promised. And so, with the dawn breaking over a city forever changed, I stepped forward into the unknown, the forbidden clock silent now, but alive within me, a defiant heartbeat against the darkness. The morning dawned heavy and grey over Paris, the streets thick with a gathering crowd whose faces were drawn taut with fear and resolve. The usual clatter of carts and chatter of vendors was subdued, replaced by the grim anticipation that had settled like a pall across the city. Today was the day of the public execution, a ritual of terror meant to remind the people of the regime's absolute power. Yet beneath the surface, something different stirred, something dangerous. I stood cloaked in the shadows near the place de la Revolution, my heart hammering against my ribs, like the ticking of the forbidden clock hidden beneath my coat. The small device, outlawed and precious, counted down not just to the execution, but to a moment of reckoning that could alter our fates. Its rhythmic ticking was a whisper of hope in a city strangled by silence. Lucille was close beside me, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with fierce determination. Her presence was a steadying force against the storm of nerves that threatened to overwhelm me. Jack has lingered near the edges, his sharp gaze flicking between the guards and the sea of faces, wary and alert. Among the enforcers stood Commissaire Dubois, his cold, commanding presence a looming threat. The crowd was a restless mass, a river of humanity caught between dread and defiance. Mothers clutched children, workers traded anxious glances, and furtive whispers passed like sparks along dry tinder. The guillotine stood stark and unyielding at the center, its blade gleaming like a silent promise of death. As the condemned man was brought forth, a hush fell, the weight of inevitability pressing down. But then, with a trembling hand, I produced the forbidden clock, lifting it where all could see. Its ticking, steady and deliberate, cut through the silence like a blade. A murmur rose, uncertain at first, then swelling into a roar of recognition and resistance. Faces turned toward me, eyes widening in shock and wonder. The clock was more than a machine. It was a symbol, a defiant heartbeat against the regime's tyranny. Lucille squeezed my hand, her courage igniting mine. The crowd leaned in, the ticking becoming a chant, a rhythm to which the city's pulse now beat. Commissaire Dubois's gaze snapped to me, his lips tightening. He barked orders, but the guards hesitated, caught in the tide of growing unrest. The executioner paused, the blade suspended in the cold air as the crowd's voice rose in unison. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the storm inside. This clock counts down not to the end, but to the beginning of our freedom, our memory, our fight against oblivion. We are not prisoners of time's shadow, but its masters. Today, we reclaim our destiny. The crowd erupted, a wave of noise and movement breaking over the square. Some wept, others shouted, all united in a moment that transcended fear. The regime's grip faltered as the forbidden clock's ticking became a rallying cry. In the chaos, Lucille and Jax moved swiftly, guiding the frightened and the hopeful alike to safety. I stayed, feeling the weight of history pressing down and the fragile promise of change rising. As the blade finally fell, its clang echoing through the square, I knew the fight was far from over. But in that moment, beneath the shadow of death, a spark had been lit, a spark that would not be easily extinguished. The city was awakening, trembling on the cusp of revolution, and I, Teen Moreau, was at its heart. The forbidden clock had stopped, but its message had just begun. And so, as the crowd dispersed into the winding streets, their voices still echoing with hope and defiance, I felt the first true breath of freedom stir the cold Parisian air. The battle for our souls was only beginning, but the shadows had been pierced, if only for a moment. The clock's ticking had become our heartbeat. The long night was not yet over, but the dawn was near. The city woke beneath a sky bruised with the pale, uncertain light of dawn, a fragile calm after the storm of the previous night's upheaval. From my vantage point on the rooftop, the weight of what had transpired settled heavily on my shoulders. Smoke still drifted lazily from scattered fires, curling upward like dark fingers clawing at the fragile morning. The distant clang of bells echoed faintly, mingling with the murmurs of early risers and the far-off cries of the wounded. In the heart of Paris, the square that had witnessed so many of our whispered plans and desperate hopes was transformed. The forbidden clock, once hidden deep within the shadows of my workshop, now stood boldly in the open, a heartbeat that defied the silence imposed by tyranny. Its steady ticking, a sound so simple yet so profound, cut through the lingering fear like a blade. Faces turned towards it, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning hope. The crowd was a mosaic of the city's shattered souls, faces marked by hardship, eyes glistening with the promise of something new, something dangerous. Lucille moved among them like a guardian angel, her dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp and unyielding. She tended to the wounded with hands both gentle and firm, her presence a beacon of compassion amid the chaos. I watched her pause over a young man whose arm was dark with blood, her fingers steady as she wrapped makeshift bandages around the wound. Her resolve was infectious, a flame kindling in the hearts of those who had only known despair. Jacques lingered nearby, his rugged face with scars and shadows of doubt. His eyes flickered with the weight of survival and the burden of choices made in the shadows. He caught my gaze and gave a slight nod and unspoken acknowledgement of the risks we had all taken, the roads we had chosen. Yet, amidst this fragile victory, the spectre of Commissaire Dubois loomed large. In the austere confines of his office, he stood alone, the silence pressing in like a vice. His cold gaze, once sharp and unyielding, softened for a moment, betraying the internal conflict that churned beneath his stern exterior. The order he had so fiercely defended was fracturing, slipping through his fingers like sand. The cost of control was high, and even he was not immune to the toll it exacted. Our defiance had shattered more than the silence had cracked the very foundation of the regime's control. But victory was a double-edged sword. The streets bore witness to the price, the blood of comrades lost, the anguished cries of families torn apart, and the heavy burden of those left to carry the torch forward. As I descended from the rooftop and rejoined the throng, the ticking of the forbidden clock echoed in my ears, a relentless reminder of both the fragility and the power of hope. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, beneath the fractured dawn, we had broken the chains of fear. The city stirred, tentative and trembling, but alive with the possibility of change. I caught Lucille's eye across the square, and in her gaze I saw the reflection of my own resolve, a promise that we would endure, that the light we had kindled in the darkest hour would not be extinguished. The past weighed heavy, but the future beckoned uncertain and bright. We were no longer prisoners of time's shadow. We were its challengers, and the hour had come to forge a new destiny. The streets of Paris whispered of revolution, not just in the roar of rebellion, but in the quiet, persistent ticking of a clock that dared to count down not to death, but to the birth of freedom. And yet, as the city breathed a shaky breath of hope, the question lingered like a shadow. Could this fragile spark withstand the darkness that still threatened to engulf us? The chains were broken, but the fight was only beginning. The forbidden clock ticked on, a defiant heartbeat in the face of oblivion. And I, Tien Moreau, stood ready to meet whatever time had yet to bring. The dawn had broken, but the day was far from done. The rain fell steadily over Paris, a relentless curtain of cold that blurred the edges of the city's battered streets. Commissaire Dubois stood alone in his office, the dim glow of a single candle barely piercing the gloom. His gaze was fixed on the rain-streaked window, watching as the city he thought he understood shifted beneath storm clouds of uncertainty and change. The distant murmur of voices, the occasional clatter of footsteps on cobblestones, and the faint echo of a shutter banging in the wind were the only sounds that dared breach the heavy silence of the room. It was a silence that mirrored the turmoil roiling within him, a man torn between duty and doubt, between the cold iron of law and the fragile human cost his orders had wrought. Dubois's uniform hung heavily on his broad frame, the austere lines of the revolutionary police marking him as a figure of authority and fear. Yet tonight, that authority felt brittle, as if the very foundation of the regime he had sworn to uphold was crumbling beneath his feet. The uprising, sparked by Tiani's defiant act and the forbidden clock's relentless ticking, had shaken the heart of the city and fractured the iron grip of terror. The streets were quieter now, but the peace was uneasy, trembling on the edge of chaos. He turned away from the window, the weight of his thoughts pressing down like the storm outside. Memories flickered unbidden, the faces of those he had ordered arrested, the cries of the condemned, and the silent anguish of a city caught between revolution and ruin. For the first time, Du Bois questioned the path he had chosen. Was the strict control he championed truly the path to peace, or had it only sown deeper seeds of resentment and rebellion? Far from the cold stone walls of the police headquarters, Tyne Moreau walked through the awakening city, his breath rising in pale clouds that mingled with the morning mist. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of muted rose and grey, casting long shadows over barricades now dismantled and streets littered with the remnants of conflict. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke, a reminder of the battles fought in the name of freedom. Tyne's steps were measured and quiet, his sharp eyes scanning the familiar streets with a mixture of relief and caution. The forbidden clock, now silent but still alive in memory, had marked the turning point, the moment when fear gave way to defiance. Yet the road ahead was uncertain, fraught with the lingering threat of reprisals and the fragile nature of victory. Each step he took was a silent pledge to continue the fight, to nurture the fragile flame of hope flickering against the encroaching darkness. Back in a cramped attic lit by the weak glow of a single lantern, Lucille and Jax huddled close, their voices low but fierce. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of recent losses and the urgency of survival. Lucille's dark eyes burned with a fierce determination that belied the exhaustion etched into her face. Jax's rugged features were drawn tight, every scar a testament to battles both external and internal. They whispered plans and possibilities, weighing risks and alliances, the delicate threads of trust stretched taut between them. Despite his cynicism, Jax found himself drawn into the shared purpose that united them, the desire to protect those condemned by the regime and to kindle the sparks of rebellion that might one day blaze into a revolution of justice. Theirs was a bond forged in shadows, fragile yet unyielding. Meanwhile, in the quiet refuge of his workshop, Tian sat with Henry, the young apprentice whose eager eyes held the promise of a future yet unwritten. The flickering candlelight danced across the worn wood and gleaming metal, casting shifting patterns that seemed to echo the uncertain times. Tiny's hands moved with familiar precision, repairing a delicate gear, but his mind was far away, contemplating the legacy he was entrusted to pass on. He spoke softly to Henry, words heavy with meaning beneath their simple surface. "This is more than craft, more than time itself," he said. "It is memory, resistance, and hope. We keep the past alive to shape what is yet to come." Henry listened intently, the weight of responsibility settling upon his young shoulders, tempered by the resilience of youth and the courage of those who had come before. The city outside stirred with cautious life, the shadows receding but never fully gone. The fight for freedom was far from over. Yet in that small workshop, amid ticking tools and whispered promises, a new chapter began, one written not just in the passage of time, but in the steadfast hearts of those who dared to defy it. As the dawn grew brighter, Tan stepped outside, the cold morning air sharp against his skin. He paused, looking back toward the workshop's darkened window, the silent clock's legacy etched into the very fabric of his being. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by loss and sacrifice, but illuminated by the fragile light of hope that refused to be extinguished. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the storm and the fading echoes of revolution, the city waited poised on the cusp of change, its fate intertwined with the courage of those who dared to dream of liberty. The shadows might recede, but the struggle endured, relentless as time itself. "We are the keepers of the flame," Tyne whispered to the dawn, "and no shadow, however long, can snuff it out." Outside, the first birds began to sing, tentative notes rising in the cool air, a fragile melody of resilience and renewal, carried on the breath of a city reborn. The workshop was quiet, save for the delicate ticking of a modest pocket watch that Tyne held in his calloused hands. It was a sound so ordinary yet profound, a subtle testament to the persistence of time and spirit alike. Henry sat opposite him, fingers trembling as he tried to align the tiny gear within the watch's intricate mechanism. Tyne's eyes softened as he leaned forward, his voice low yet steady. "No need to rush, Henry. Watchmaking is patience, a careful balance of precision and care. Like life itself." Henry swallowed nervously but smiled, encouraged by Tyne's calm presence. The workshop, once shadowed by fear and secrecy, now breathed a tentative air of hope. Sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting long patterns on the worn wooden floor. Each tick from their watches was a small victory, an assertion that time could still be counted on their terms. Lucille entered quietly, her dark hair pulled back, eyes bright with the fire of recent news. "The others are ready," she whispered, setting a folded note on the table. "They believe in what you're redoing." Tyne nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a mantle he could no longer deny. The forbidden clock, once a constant companion and symbol of their struggle, now rested silent on a shelf. Its cracked glass face bore witness to the battles fought and sacrifices made. Yet its silence was not defeat, it was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. He rose, moving toward the clock with reverence. His fingers traced the faded engravings, memories flooding back the sound of the guillotine's fall, the faces of those lost, the whispered promises of freedom. "The time it measured has ended," Tien said softly, "but the resistance does not die with its last tick." Henry watched him, eyes wide, absorbing the gravity of the moment. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Tyne replied, "we carry the flame forward. You, me, Lucille, and all those who dare to dream of liberty. The clock was our guide, but the true power lies in us, in our courage, our memory, our defiance." Days passed with renewed purpose. The workshop became a haven, a crucible where plans were formed and alliances strengthened. Under Tyne's patient tutelage, Henry flourished, his youthful enthusiasm a balm to weary hearts. Lucille's quiet strength and fierce loyalty wove through their small circle like a protective thread. One evening, as twilight deepened the shadows outside, Tyne and Lucille stood on the balcony overlooking the restless city. The air was cool, carrying the distant murmur of footsteps and whispered conversations. "Paris will never be free unless we keep fighting," Lucille said, her voice steady against the chill. Tyne nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light of day struggled against encroaching darkness. "And fight we shall." The clock's silence is not the end, but a beginning. Inside, the small group gathered once more, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight. Notes were passed, plans whispered, and resolve hardened. Each member understood the cost, yet found strength in unity. The legacy of the forbidden clock had transcended its mechanism, it lived in their hearts, a spark that no tyrant could extinguish. In the days that followed, Tyne often found himself pausing, listening for the faintest tick, as if the clock still spoke through the courage of those it inspired. His journey from cautious survivor to determined mentor was complete. The shadows of the past still lingered, but now they stood illuminated by the fragile light of hope. As the chapter of the clock's countdown closed, another unfolded, one of resilience, remembrance, and relentless pursuit of freedom. For Tyne and his companions, time was no longer a chain but a promise that even in the darkest hour, the human spirit could defy fate and kindle the long flame of liberty. And so, with steady hands and unwavering hearts, they prepared to face whatever dawn might bring, knowing that the true measure of time lay not in seconds or minutes, but in the courage to act and the will to endure. The watchmaker's resolve was set. The fight was far from over. The dim light of the workshop painted long shadows across the worn wooden floor, each beam flickering like a fragile heartbeat against the oppressive darkness. Tyne sat hunched over his workbench, fingers trembling slightly as they traced the delicate gears of the now silent forbidden clock. The faint echo of its last tick lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of all that had been lost. His sharp eyes, usually so steady and calculating, shimmered with the wetness of unshed tears. Around him, The walls seemed to close in with memories, faces of comrades lost, the sharp crack of musket fire, the cold steel of betrayal. He pressed a hand to the table, grounding himself in the tangible, in the craft that had once been his refuge, and now his rebellion. Each loss carved deeper lines into his soul, yet beneath the crushing weight was a stubborn ember, a defiant flicker that refused to be extinguished. The rebellion was more than a cause. It was the fragile thread holding together the remnants of their humanity. Lucille's footsteps softened against the creaking boards as she entered, her dark hair tousled, eyes shadowed with exhaustion yet burning with an unyielding fire. In her arms, she cradled a wounded rebel, his breaths shallow but steady under her care. She moved with practiced grace, her hands gentle as she tended to the wounds, whispering words of comfort that seemed to soothe more than the flesh. Tian watched her, heart heavy with admiration and sorrow. The cost of defiance was relentless, each act of courage paid for in blood and tears. "Hell pull through," Lucille said quietly, meeting Tian's gaze. "We must believe that. We have to." Her voice was a lifeline, a fragile hope thrown across the abyss of despair. Tyne nodded, swallowing the ache that threatened to unravel him. "We do." Later, in the flickering candlelight of a cramped safe house, Tian sat across from Jack's. The rugged man's scarred face was unreadable, every line etched by hardship and shadowed doubt. Their conversation was cautious, edged with the mistrust that years of danger had bred between them. Yet beneath the surface was a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the heavy toll exacted by their struggle. "We can't afford more mistakes," Jax muttered, voice low but fierce. "Every loss weakens us." Tyner's fingers tightened around the cup in his hand. "But giving up would mean losing everything we fight for." A silence fell, heavy but not oppressive, filled instead with the weight of unspoken fears and hopes intertwined. It was in these moments that the fragile bonds of their resistance were both tested and strengthened. Their defiance was a collective heartbeat, fragile and fierce. Back in the workshop, Henry watched Tian with wide, earnest eyes. The young apprentice's youthful hope was a stark contrast to the somber shadows that clung to the older watchmaker. When Tian finally rose and closed the heavy door behind him, Henry's gaze followed with quiet reverence. In that look was a promise that the memory of the fallen and the spirit of rebellion would endure beyond the dark hours, carried forward by those willing to bear the cost. Tian paused, hand resting on the door's worn surface, feeling the weight of the past and the fragile promise of the future. The echoes of loss were many, but so too were the whispers of hope. In the heart of despair, the fight for freedom still flickered, a fragile light in the encroaching darkness. The city outside remained cloaked in fear and shadow, but within these walls, amidst grief and sacrifice, something unbreakable was taking root. Tyne knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril, but he was no longer alone in carrying the burden. Together, they would face whatever dawn awaited, their hearts bound by memory, loss, and the unyielding desire for liberty. And in that quiet resolve, the silent clock in Tiana's heart began to tick once more, a rhythm not of time measured in seconds, but of courage measured in the unyielding spirit of resistance. As the night deepened, Tian lingered by the window, watching the faint glow of flickering lanterns across the city's darkened streets. Somewhere out there, the shadows of loss stretched long, but so did the fragile threads of hope. He whispered a vow into the cold air, one that would carry him through the darkest hours yet to come. "We will endure. We will remember. We will fight." The echoes of loss had carved deep scars into their souls, but they had also forged a resolve that no tyranny could shatter. And so, beneath the heavy cloak of night, the fragile light of hope flickered ever brighter, a beacon for those who dared to defy the shadows. The story was far from over, and Tyne knew the coming dawn would demand everything they had. But for now, in the quiet company of grief and companionship, he found a moment's peace, a fleeting breath before the storm. Outside, the city waited, holding its breath for what would come next. The clock's silent promise lingered still, a whisper against the silence. And the fight for freedom marched on. The first light of dawn filtered through the narrow streets of Paris, casting a pale golden hue upon the battered cobblestones of Rue Saint-Antoine. Tyne and Lucille stepped out from the cramped doorway of the watchmaker's shop, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. The city, once stifled beneath the iron grip of terror, now whispered tentative promises of renewal. The scent of fresh bread from nearby boulangeries mingled with the faint, persistent smoke rising from chimneys, a reminder that life, stubborn and unyielding, sought to reclaim its place amid the ruins. Their footsteps echoed softly as they walked side by side, the silence between them comfortable, weighted with unspoken understanding. Every so often, their hands brushed a fleeting contact charged with an urgency neither dared to name aloud. For Tyne, this small gesture was a defiant pulse of warmth against a world that had known too much cold cruelty. For Lucille, it was the fragile bud of a hope she had long thought extinguished. "The city feels different today," Lucille murmured, breaking the quiet as they passed a group of children chasing one another with ragged clothes and unbridled laughter. "As if the air itself has begun to breathe again." Tian nodded, his sharp eyes tracing the fluttering tricolour flags that adorned shopfronts and balconies. "It is a dawn unlike any we have seen. Yet I fear the shadows of the past still linger, waiting to reclaim us." They paused near a fountain where the water, clear and steady, reflected the pale sky. Tyne reached into his coat and drew out a small, delicately crafted timepiece, not the forbidden clock that had once counted down to despair, but a new creation, a symbol of the future he dared to imagine. "Henry will learn from this," Tien said softly. "It is time to pass on what remains of our craft, our memory." Lucille smiled, the corners of her determined eyes softening. And with it, the promise that time will no longer be a chain but a gift. Later, back in the dim sanctuary of the watchmaker's shop, Henry sat eagerly at a worn wooden bench, his youthful face bright with curiosity despite the scars the city bore. Tyne guided his apprentice's hands carefully, showing him the delicate gears and springs that brought life to the tiny mechanism. "Each piece has a purpose," Tyne explained, his voice steady but infused with reverence. "Together, they keep time, not just the hours and minutes, but the moments that shape us." Henry's eyes widened as he listened, absorbing every word as if it were a sacred secret. Madame Fournier, standing quietly behind them, watched with a protective gaze, her stern features softened by the flickering candlelight. Outside, Lucille lingered by the window, her gaze lost among the rooftops of Paris, where fluttering flags and distant church bells marked the slow, cautious return of normalcy. Her heart carried the weight of grief for those lost, yet beneath it, it burned a fierce determination to see the city rise anew. Tyne joined her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "We carry their memory with us," he said, "not as chains, but as fuel for the fire of freedom." Their eyes met, sharing a moment of quiet solidarity that spoke of battles fought and those yet to come. In the sanctuary of Madame Fournier's shop, amid ticking clocks and whispered hopes, Tyne and Lucille exchanged a promise to nurture this new dawn together, to protect the fragile light flickering in the heart of a city reborn. As the day unfolded, the streets of Paris slowly filled with cautious voices and tentative smiles. In the face of destruction, life persisted, weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. Tyne knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, yet for the first time in many months, he allowed himself to believe that the future might be shaped not by fear, but by courage and love. And so, beneath the pale morning sky, the clock of their lives began anew, its steady ticking a testament to the enduring spirit of a city and its people, bound together by memory, sacrifice, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom. The story of their struggle was far from over, but in this fragile dawn, Tyne saw a promise that even in the darkest hour, the light of hope could never be fully extinguished. The forbidden clock was silent now, But its legacy lived on in the hearts of those who dared to dream, to resist, and to love. As the city stirred to life, Tyne and Lucille stepped forward, hand in hand, ready to face whatever shadows the future might bring, their spirits intertwined with the fragile light of a new dawn. Their journey was just beginning. The workshop was cloaked in a silence that Tyne had never truly known before. His fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the forbidden clock resting on the worn wooden table, its face now frozen. The hands arrested in their final position, a stark contrast to the relentless ticking that had once defiantly measured the moments left until the return of the last victim of the guillotine. The candle beside it sputtered, its flame casting a fragile glow that played upon the dust-speckled air and the cracked walls that bore the weight of many hidden stories. Tyne's breath came slow and deliberate, as if trying to draw strength from the very stillness that surrounded him. He had tended the clock through days darkened by fear and nights shattered by the distant clang of the guillotine's blade. It had been his heartbeat in the shadowed corridors of Paris, a whispered promise that time, though cruel and unyielding, might yet be bent by human courage and memory. Now, with the last tick silenced, Tian felt the paradox of time's cruel finality and the fragile hope it also carried. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. The first pale fingers of dawn crept over the rooftops, brushing the soot-darkened stones with a tentative light that neither erased the scars of violence nor the etching absence left by those lost. Tyne's gaze drifted toward the narrow window, where the streets below hummed softly with the uncertain rhythms of a city waking from a long, oppressive night. The cries of vendors, the clatter of footsteps, and the distant murmur of voices wove a tapestry of life that refused to be silenced, even as shadows of the past lingered. In that moment, Tyne was not alone. The door creaked open gently and Henry stepped inside, his youthful face alight with a mixture of curiosity and determination. Clasped carefully in his hands was a small watch, its brass casing still gleaming despite the grime of the times. Tyne's eyes softened as the boy approached, placing the watch upon the table with reverence. "Master," Henry whispered, "I have finished it." The simplicity of the gesture, the quiet pride in the apprentice's voice, stirred something deep within Tian. It was more than a timepiece, it was a symbol of continuity, a thread connecting past struggles to the promise of future days. He reached out, steadying his hand on Henry's shoulder with a gentle firmness. "It is good," Tyne replied softly. "The hands may move, but it is the heart that must guide them. Remember that." Henry nodded, eyes shining with the weight of understanding that transcended words. As the young watchmaker turned to leave, Tian felt a stirring of hope, fragile yet unyielding. Before Henry could close the door behind him, a shadow appeared in the threshold. Lucille, her dark hair framing a face marked by both hardship and fierce resolve. Her eyes met Tien's, and in that silent exchange, a world of unspoken promises passed between them. She stepped inside, closing the door gently, as if to shield the fragile sanctuary they had carved from the chaos outside. "The city breathes," she said quietly, "and with it, so do we." Tyne nodded, the weight of countless memories pressing upon him, the faces of those lost, the clang of the guillotine, the stolen moments of laughter and whispered plans. Yet beneath it all was the truth he had come to accept. Time, relentless and unforgiving, could be both a captor and a liberator. Though the last ticking had ceased, the spirit it embodied would resonate beyond the hands of any clock. He reached out, fingertips brushing the cold surface of the forbidden clock one final time. It was a farewell and a benediction, a silent vow that though the mechanism was still, the fight it symbolized would endure. The candle flickered once more, casting long shadows that seemed to dance to an unheard rhythm. Outside, the murmurs of Paris grew stronger, a city awakening to the dawn of a new day. Tyne inhaled deeply, the scent of old wood and melting wax mingling with the crisp morning air that slipped through the cracked window. We carry the time, he whispered to Lucille, not in gears or hands, but in memory and courage. She smiled, a quiet flame of hope kindling in her eyes. Then let us make sure it never stops. As the first light spilled across the worn floors of the workshop, Tian felt the paradox settle within him. Time's end was not an end at all, but a beginning. The last ticking had passed, but the story was far from over. And in that fragile moment between shadow and light, the promise of liberty flickered once more. The clock was silent, yet Tian's heart beat with renewed purpose. The legacy of resistance, born in the shadow of the guillotine and nurtured by defiant ticks, would live on in the hands of those who dared to remember, to hope, and to fight. Outside, Paris awakened, its breath steady and unbroken. And within the quiet workshop, the last ticking echoed an eternal defiance against the relentless march of time. The workshop was quiet, but for the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath our feet and the soft, measured breathing of Henry as he sat cross-legged beside the workbench. The forbidden clock, once a relentless heartbeat counting down our precarious hopes, now rested silent, its glass face dulled by dust and shadow. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool metal casing one last time before gently placing it within the hidden compartment carved into the wall behind the shelves. The act was heavy with finality, yet beneath it stirred a pulse of something far more enduring than the mechanics of gears and springs of promise. Henry looked up at me, his bright eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and eagerness. "Will it ever tick again?" he asked, voice low, almost afraid to break the solemnity. I shook my head softly, a faint smile breaking through the wariness etched into my face. "No, mon garçon, but its silence does not mean the end. It is now a symbol, a guardian of memory, of all we've endured and all that must come." Lucille stepped closer, her dark hair catching the dim light that filtered through the grimy window. Her eyes, fierce and unwavering, met mine. "We are the guardians now," she said, voice steady, not of a clock, but of the story it told, the defiance, the hope. We carry it forward. The three of us formed a quiet circle, the weight of our shared burden settling around us like a cloak. Outside, the city stirred faintly, as if sensing a fragile dawn breaking beyond the horizon. The reign of terror's shadow had not fully lifted, but cracks were beginning to show in its oppressive facade. I moved to the bench where Henry sat, pulling a small pocket watch from my coat. It was one of the few timepieces still allowed, a simple, unassuming thing, but to Henry it was a treasure. Carefully, I showed him how to wind it, how to listen for the steady tick that marked not just the passage of moments, but the persistence of life itself. "Every watch has a story," I told him softly, "a story of who made it, who carried it, and the times it witnessed. Our task is to ensure those stories don't vanish into the silence." Henry nodded, absorbing each word with the eager seriousness of youth tempered by the harsh lessons of our times. He was the future, the next generation caught in the tremors of revolution and repression. In him, I saw the fragile hope that, despite everything, life would press onward. Lucille moved to the door, glancing back with a determined spark. "The underground network is growing stronger," she reported. "More people believe in the cause, in the promise of freedom. We carry messages, warnings, and the stories of those lost." Her words were a balm and a call to arms. The resistance was no longer just whispers and secret clocks. It was becoming a living, breathing force, forged in the crucible of shared loss and unyielding courage. Night had fallen when we parted ways, the streets slick with recent rain, the scent of wet stone and earth rising in the cool air. Lucille disappeared into the labyrinth of alleys, a shadow among shadows, while Henry and I returned to the workshop, the quiet sanctuary where the past and future intertwined. I stood by the window, watching as the gas lamps flickered to life, casting pools of amber light that battled the encroaching darkness. The city was a mosaic of fractured hopes and whispered dreams, a place where every heartbeat was a rebellion against the silence imposed upon us. Will the fight ever truly end? Henry asked quietly, the question hanging between us like a fragile thread. I turned to him, placing a hand on his shoulder, steadying both his body and spirit. No, I said. The fight is eternal, but so is the light we kindle in the darkest hours. It is our task to keep that light burning for ourselves, for those who cannot, and for those yet to come. The forbidden clock may have ceased its ticking, but its legacy was alive, etched into every act of courage, every whispered story, and every heartbeat that refused to be silenced. We were its guardians now, bound not by mechanics but by memory and hope. As dawn approached, the first pale light spilled over the rooftops, washing the city in a fragile glow. I breathed deeply, the weight of the past mingling with the promise of what lay ahead. The long night was ending, but the journey was far from over. Our hands would craft the future, one careful tick at a time. The night had settled over Paris like a heavy shroud, but within the dim confines of his cell, Commissaire Dubois found no peace. The candle's flame flickered erratically, casting long shadows that danced on the cold stone walls, a restless echo of the turmoil within him. He sat motionless, the stern mask of the revolutionary enforcer softened by the weight of doubt. Outside, the city was stirring in subtle ways, murmurs of unrest, the distant clatter of hurried footsteps, whispers that carried the promise of change. The iron grip of the regime, so long unyielding, now showed signs of strain. Dubois's mind turned over memories and commands, the faces of those he'd pursued, and the ideals he once held firm. But tonight, the certainty had slipped, replaced by a gnawing question of purpose. Far from the prison's cold stone, the quiet workshop where Tian Moreau had once hidden his forbidden clock, now hummed with the cautious stirrings of hope. Morning light, pale and tentative, seeped through cracked windows, casting a soft glow over the battered tools and scattered papers. Tyne stood beside Lucille and Henry, each face marked by fatigue yet illuminated by resolve. They spoke in hushed tones, voices taut with urgency but trembling with the fragile thrill of possibility. Plans were drawn, alliances renewed, and the faint pulse of rebellion beat steadily beneath their words. The clock's silent legacy lingered in Tanny's heart, a symbol that time, though relentless, could be defied. Outside, the streets of Paris lay hushed, the usual clamor subdued beneath the weight of uncertainty. Shuttered windows and shuttered hearts alike awaited the dawn. The once oppressive presence of guards had thinned, their footsteps less assured. Only the whisper of wind threading through broken panes and the soft echo of distant footsteps hinted at the city's slow awakening. It was a breath held, a moment suspended between the old and the new, where the shadow of tyranny began to wane. Yet beneath that silence lurked the tension of unknown threats, shadows that might yet rise to challenge the fragile promise of freedom. Within the fortress of power, Dubois faced his own battle. A terse exchange with a subordinate revealed fissures in loyalty. Whispers of desertion and quiet dissent cut through the ranks like a chill wind. The once monolithic force of revolutionary zeal now showed cracks, as men and women confronted the cost of obedience and the weight of conscience. Dubois's commands, once absolute, now met hesitation and murmured doubts. The austere uniform he wore felt heavier, a symbol not of strength, but of the burden he bore. His cold gaze met the eyes of those around him, eyes that no longer shone with unwavering conviction, but flickered with uncertainty. The long night of oppression was nearing its end, but the dawn was a fragile thing, uncertain and unformed. Tiny's footsteps echoed softly as he moved among the scattered tools and plans, his thoughts weaving between memory and vision. The clock that once counted down to despair now symbolized something greater, the enduring spirit of resistance, the refusal to be bound by fate's cruel decree. Beside him, Lucille's steady presence grounded him, her fierce loyalty a beacon amid the encroaching darkness. Henry's youthful hope reminded him that the future was not yet written, that the fight for freedom was a legacy to be passed on, fragile but unbroken. As dawn crept over the horizon, the city held its breath. Paris was a city caught between worlds, the fading shadow of tyranny and the uncertain light of liberty. Dubois, once the embodiment of ruthless order, now stood at a crossroads, his purpose unraveling as the regime's power faltered. Tyne and his companions prepared to step into the new day, their hearts steeled for the challenges ahead. The long night was ending, but the struggle for freedom was far from over. In the fragile quiet of dawn, hope flickered a fragile light that promised the possibility of a new beginning. "The fight is not done," Tyne whispered to Lucille as they watched the first pale rays touch the rooftops. "But perhaps, for the first time, we carry the chance to shape what comes next." Lucille nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. "We will hold the light, Tyne. Even if the night returns, we will not let it consume us." And in that moment, beneath the fading shadow of the long night, the promise of freedom stirred anew, fragile but unyielding. The city was changing. The first pale light of dawn crept over the jagged rooftops of Paris, casting long, trembling shadows across the narrow streets below. From my vantage on the crumbling ledge of an ancient building, I gazed out over the city, a city forever changed by the storm we had set in motion. The air was crisp and biting, carrying with it the faint, ghostly echo of a ticking clock that no longer counted down. The forbidden clock, the heartbeat of our rebellion, now lay silent, its final moment past. Yet its legacy reverberated through every whispered hope and trembling fear that lingered in these streets. I drew my coat tighter against the morning chill, my eyes tracing the familiar contours of a city both haunted and hopeful. The guillotine's shadow still loomed, though its blade had fallen less often in recent days. Faces I remembered, friends, strangers, those lost to the relentless tyranny, rose unbidden in my mind. Their sacrifices had carved a path, jagged and perilous, toward a fragile dawn. I wondered, as I had countless times before, if the fragile light we nurtured could truly outshine the darkness that had so long enveloped us. A soft rustle behind me drew my attention. Lucille stepped onto the rooftop, her silhouette framed by the rising sun. Her dark hair was tousled by the morning breeze, and the determined gleam in her eyes had not dimmed despite all we had endured. We stood in silence for a moment, two souls bound by shared loss and the unyielding desire for freedom. "It's over," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a breath. "The countdown has ended," I replied, "but perhaps it was never about the end of time, but what we choose to do with it." Together, we descended from the rooftop and made our way to the workshop where the clock had been hidden for so long. The air inside was thick with dust and memories, the faint scent of oil and worn wood lingering like a ghost. I approached the shelf where the forbidden clock rested, its once proud hands now frozen in place. I lifted it gently, fingers tracing the delicate engravings worn smooth by years of secrecy and hope. Lucille placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Its silence is not defeat," she said. "It is a promise that we remember, that we continue." As the sun climbed higher, I thought of Henry, my young apprentice, whose eager eyes held the spark of a future I dared to believe in. In the marketplace, I had seen him just days prior, showing a small handmade watch to a group of wide-eyed children. Their laughter had been a balm to my weary heart, a reminder that the story we fought to preserve would live on, carried by those who came after us. But our victory was not without cost. The faces of those we had lost, friends like Jack's, whose shadow still haunted the edges of my thoughts, reminded me of the price exacted by rebellion. Even Commissaire Dubois, our relentless pursuer, was not immune to the shifting tides. Our final encounter in the alley had left an indelible mark on me, the cold gaze that held a flicker of doubt, the rigid posture softened by the weight of wary conscience. The regime's iron grip was loosening, but the struggle was far from over. I placed the clock back on its shelf, now a relic of a past both painful and proud. Its silence was not an end, but a beginning, a call to arms for those who refused to be prisoners of time's shadow. As the city stirred to life outside, I felt the fragile pulse of hope quicken within me. The fight for freedom was relentless, its path uncertain, but it was ours to walk. Turning to Lucille, I found strength in her unwavering gaze. "We have come so far," I said, "and yet the journey is just beginning." She smiled, a rare, luminous thing in these dark days. "Then we keep moving forward, together." And so, beneath the fading shadows of revolution, we stepped into the light of a new day. The forbidden clock's time had ended, but the story it told, the story of resistance, memory, and the indomitable human spirit, would echo through the ages. In the fragile flicker of freedom's shadow, I found the courage to believe that even in the darkest hour, hope could endure. The city breathed around us, its heartbeat slow but steady, a testament to those who dared to defy fate. And as I closed my eyes for a moment, I heard once more the faintest whisper of a ticking clock, an eternal reminder that time, though relentless, can be bent by those brave enough to challenge its course. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while I felt ready to carry the legacy forward, to teach Henry, to stand with Lucille, and to face whatever shadows remained. For in the heart of Paris, beneath the scars of revolution, freedom's fragile light flickered, still waiting to be tended, cherished, and defended.